My name is Joel Hoffman. I did not do my bio in person, so I'm not going to repeat my bio. My specialty is languages and Hebrew, and we were talking about fairness. Just a check, can the people in the room hear with the microphone? Is it working all right? Excellent. I thought it might be better audio when I was not using the microphone, but apparently we have, it's not fair to the people on the live stream if we don't use the microphone. I apologize for that. It's not fair. Now, the people on the live stream don't know why that's an interesting comment, and I will tell you, we are talking about fairness. The question I had asked was whether ever in your life you remember somebody complaining it's not fair. Either yourself, children complain it's not fair all the time. There is hardly anything more frustrating for a child than it's not fair. If you punish someone for something they didn't do, they complain. But if they get caught and they have an accomplice and you don't punish the accomplice, we're not talking about holding up a bank, by the way. I mean, like, things children do. And you don't punish the accomplice, the person who gets caught says it's not fair that I'm being punished and someone else isn't. Fairness is very deeply built into humans, and not just humans. Animals understand fairness. The great apes understand fairness, monkeys understand fairness, even dogs understand fairness. There's a fascinating experiment where you take a couple of dogs and you give them various kinds of food. If you give them both food that they are, sort of like and sort of don't like, they'll eat it. If you give them both food that they really, really like, they will eat it. Here's what's interesting. If you take the two dogs and you give one of the dogs really good food and the other dog mediocre food, the dog that got the mediocre food will not eat it in protest because it's not fair. The dog that would eat the mediocre food if the other dog got mediocre food will not eat the mediocre food if the other dog is getting something better. Question? I actually can't hear you so well. Can you stand up or? Wow, that's a good question. You get a point for a good question. Here in the live room, we have two different sides separated by an aisle. So far, the one on my left has 1 point. Not that it's a competition, but that side's ahead. That's not fair. So why does the dog that gets the good food eat the food even though it's not fair? I don't know. I'm not a dog psychiatrist. And apparently, there are people who are dog psychiatrists, so I don't know, but it's a really interesting question. I'm sorry? I think that humans do the same thing, that's right, and that's why it's such an interesting question. I think that by and large, we are better at noticing unfairness when we get the short end of the stick than the long end of the stick. Though, let me say, Temple Emanu-El of the city of New York is very good at noticing that we have, to be perfectly blunt, money that many people don't, and raising money to put to good causes, recognizing that the world is not fair, that we have bounty and some people don't, and that's not fair. And this temple is especially good at what we now call tikkun olam, at balancing things out, at fixing the world. We start with the notion that fairness is very deeply ingrained, with the very important caveat that we're more likely to complain about it when we get the short end of the stick. And we have this as children. It's very deeply ingrained in who we are. Children demand fairness, and parents tend to try and give fairness. Welcome to the people walking in. Parents tend to try and give, if they have, let's say, two children, they tend to try and balance things out more or less among their children. A mistake that a lesson, rather, that our ancestors did not learn, as we're going to get to in a minute. And children end up growing up thinking that the world should be fair, and sometimes thinking that the world is fair, and that is a terrible blow to adults, which you may pronounce adults. It's a terrible blow when you grow up and you realize that the world is not fair and there is no one who's going to make it fair. And this internal conflict comes into play during the high holidays, and especially at Yom Kippur. You may remember a prayer from last night, Unetana Tokef. Let us proclaim the holiness of this day when God is our judge and God judges us. Conveniently, God is also the prosecutor and the defense attorney and the expert witness. So, it's like, and we are being judged. And it is written who will live and who will die. Does this ring a bell? Who by fire and who by water? And what does the prayer seem to say? The prayer seems to say that if you die by fire or you die by water, why is that? Because? What? The echo is... Because you always die in the end? All right, that's who by water, who by fire? The answer is, according to the prayer, it seems because you deserved it. And this is why this is the prayer that causes many people to walk out. You say to yourself, look, we're on the tail end of a pandemic. We all know people who died. Really? It says right there, who by plague, in the prayer. You're going to tell me that the people that I know who died during COVID, they died because they didn't repent? They died because they were sinners? Is that really the message of the prayer? Good people thrive, bad people suffer. Everything is fair. It seems to be, but it's not. So that's our starting point. We're going to look at a broader picture, a more nuanced picture, a more helpful picture, recognizing that we inherently have a bias toward fairness, and that inherent bias comes to hurt us when we try to understand our adult lives. We get the doctrine of goodness from Deuteronomy. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. You may remember we have this in our liturgy, we have this in our weekly service. If you follow God's ways, then God will provide the early rain and the late rain, and your crops will grow and you will thrive in the good land that God is giving you. If you stray from God's ways, then God will stop up the heavens, there will be no more rain, your crops will fail, and you will not thrive in the good land that God is giving you. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. It's a very simple philosophy. The only drawback is it doesn't work. We all know good people who have suffered, and we all know, frankly, pretty rotten people who seem to be doing really well. And because we demand fairness, both of those drive us crazy. Even in antiquity, even when they were putting the Bible together, even when they were looking at the words of Deuteronomy, they knew it wasn't true. And that's why the Bible also gives us the book of Job. The book of Job, you may remember, starts off with Job, who is the perfect man living the perfect life, a metaphor for someone who is completely sinless, completely blameless, who has never done anything wrong. Had Job lived in New York, Job would have waited for the little white man to cross every single intersection and never ever crossed between blocks. Job never did anything wrong. And then you have in the book of Job, God and the devil up on high looking at Job, and the devil says, you know, God, I bet if that man's life were ruined, he would stop praising you. And bizarrely, God says, okay, let's find out. And God gives the devil permission to destroy Job's life, and the devil does. The devil destroys Job's life. The devil kills his wife and kills his kids and kills all of his kills all of his animals, and his crops fail, and he gets terrible diseases, and he's in acute agony, and for no apparent reason. And it goes on and on and on, and sort of the bulk of the book is spent with his friends saying, look, you must have done something wrong. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. That's what they think. They say you must have done something wrong. And finally, toward the end of the book, we get to the point of the book of Job. Job has an audience with God, and Job asks God, God, why did you do this to me? And the answer is, who do you think you are? God says to Job. What makes you think, God says, you could possibly understand something as complicated as reward and punishment? God says, you don't even know how I made the oceans. And that was easy. If you can't even understand how I built the oceans, how could you ever understand why people suffer? So if Deuteronomy says that life is fundamentally fair, Job comes along and says that life is fundamentally enigmatic. It says we will never understand why good things happen and why bad things happen. So you think of any particular tragedy or any particular success, and Deuteronomy says, well, they deserved it, and Job says, you know what, who's really to say? We don't know why people thrive. We don't know why people don't. You look at Ukraine, for example. The people who are refugees from Ukraine, who are fleeing to Poland, their whole lives uprooted. Are we really going to say that they all did something wrong? Deuteronomy says that's got to be the answer. Job says, who's really to say? So far we have these two answers. We have Deuteronomy and we have the anti-Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomy says, don't believe Deuteronomy, and that's the book of Job. There are, in fact, three other ancient answers to why people suffer. There are three other ancient answers, and they come from manuscripts that have survived from 2,000 years ago. These are not manuscripts that were included in the Bible, but they could have been. They are the required background reading for the Bible. 2,000 years ago, and we're not going to go into all of the details today, 2,000 years ago, they had dozens and dozens and dozens of holy manuscripts. Then they started putting some of them into the Bible. Eventually, the Bible became known as the complete collection, but it was never intended to be the complete collection. Rather, the Bible was intended to be a best of collection, a highlights collection. Sort of like if you walk into a museum. You're not supposed to look at the entrance hall and say, well, now I've seen the whole museum. The entrance hall is meant to be a taste of what's in the museum. What might you put in an entrance hall? You might put something that you're particularly proud of. You might put something of particular relevance. You might put a sample of what you're going to see in the other wings. The entrance hall is supposed to whet your appetite for the whole museum. Similarly, the Bible was supposed to whet your appetite for the rest of the Holy Scriptures. Then, because we had the printed Bible, next thing you know, it becomes the whole thing, and people stopped reading the other books, but they were not supposed to. Some of them answer really, really important questions. For example, remember Adam and Eve from the Bible? Raise your hand just if. Remember Adam and Eve? They're living the perfect life, right? In the Garden of Eden, like literally in the Garden of Eden. The absolute perfect life. They have everything provided for them. The only thing is they're not allowed to eat from one particular tree, and so they do. And then they get kicked out. So they went from living the perfect life, and then they get caught. And then remember, God says to Adam, why did you eat from the tree of knowing good and evil? And Adam says, my wife made me do it. And the wife says, the snake made me do it. And they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. They leave their home. They're exilees. They don't even know how they're going to get food. And then, did you ever wonder what happens next to Adam and Eve? Did you ever wonder what happens after they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden? I mean, for example, did Adam keep blaming Eve? Because that could be a really long fight. Like, they lived to be 930 years old, you know? I mean, was it like 400 years they're celebrating their 400th birthday? And like, you know, Adam, you won't shut up about that stupid apple, will you? It's been 400 years, let it go. What happened to them after they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden? And it's an important question, because we are all Adam and we are all Eve. Adam means person, and Eve's name comes from the Hebrew root for life. To live your life as a human being on this planet is to be Adam, is to be Eve. The story of Adam and Eve is our story, and in particular, the story of Adam and Eve as children is the story in the Garden of Eden. Turns out there is a whole book called The Life of Adam and Eve, about the life of Adam and Eve after they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and there is a 2,000-year-old document that could have been in the Bible but wasn't, that tells us what happened to Adam and Eve after this awful tragedy. And the first thing that happens is they cry. They weep. For fully 7 days, they weep. And right away, we see that this book is a mirror on our own lives, because everybody sooner or later has an event that is so unexpected and so difficult that they cry. We can all relate to what it's like to find our lives unexpectedly in chaos. And that's what happens with Adam and Eve and this human reaction. After all, we're all Adam, we're all Eve. Adam meaning person, Eve meaning life. This is our life as humans on the face of the earth. We all have things that make us cry. Adam and Eve spend 7 days crying, and then they realize they're going to have to get food because they're hungry. And they don't know how to do it because they've never gotten food before. And once again, this book is a mirror on our lives. Part of being an adult is the realization that if you want dinner, you're going to have to procure it yourself. It's a terrifying moment when you realize that you are responsible for your life. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, as I said, is their life as children. After all, they have food provided for them, and the text tells us they're not even wearing any clothes. Who does that? Children. And then you have the adult life of Adam and Eve, where they cry because of this unexpected shock, and they realize they have to get food, and they don't know how to do it. So they devise a plan. They are going to try and get back on God's good graces, so God will let them back into the Garden of Eden. Right away, again, we see this as a mirror on our lives. They think they're trying to build for the future. We recognize they're trying to go back to the past. They think they're looking forward. We recognize they're looking backward. And again, that's what we all do when tragedy strikes. We all try and get back that which we have lost. We think we're looking forward, but our idea of looking forward is in fact recovering the past. The reader knows, we all know, that Adam and Eve are never going back to the Garden of Eden. They don't know it yet. They think if they get God to like them, they will go back to the Garden of Eden. And they devise a plan. They're going to suffer. They figure if they suffer enough, then God will like them again. It's a very curious theology, though a very widespread one. Very, very often, people who suffer a potential tragedy say something like, "Let my child get better, O God, and take my right arm in return. Let me get sick so they don't get sick." We figure if we suffer, they won't suffer. Similarly, Adam and Eve say, if they suffer long enough, God will take them back into the Garden of Eden. And they devise a plan. Their plan is they're going to wade neck deep in water, each one in a different river. And they talk about how long they're going to stay in the river. It has to be long enough that they really suffer, but not so long that they can't follow through. Because if they promise to stay for a long time and they don't follow through, then God might like them not more but less because they broke another promise. So they each go into a river and they agree on a set time, and Adam's over here and Eve is over here in the river, and as Eve is in the river, along comes the devil, the leader of darkness himself. But he's in disguise because he's tricky. That's how he got to be the devil. And he says to Eve, who doesn't recognize him, he says, "Eve, it's enough time in the river. Come on, come out already." She doesn't know this man, doesn't know what to do. She doesn't say anything. The devil tries again. "Eve, come on, it's enough already. What are you wasting your time in the river for?" She doesn't say anything. And then the devil says, who's still in disguise, "Eve, Adam sent me to come get you." And with that, she comes out of the water before the end of her promise. She collapses of exhaustion, and then she and the devil go over to find Adam. And Adam recognizes the devil, and Adam sees what's happened, and he screams at his wife, "Eve, how could you have let the devil trick you again?" Like a child, Adam doesn't understand the power of his words, and he's surprised when Eve collapses in tears. And then Adam softens his voice and talks to his wife. And then the devil is right there, and he asks the devil the question we all want answered. Adam says to the devil, "Why did you do this to us?" "What did we ever do to you?" Adam asks that you should do this to us. Adam actually has a sarcastic side to him. Adam asks, what, there are no other animals on the earth for you to hunt? You had to hunt us? What did we ever do? Adam doubles down. And the devil gives an answer. And remember, we are all Adam and we are all Eve. This is all a metaphor. This is the answer from the leader of darkness of why people suffer. What did I ever do to you? Why are you doing this to us? And the devil answers. The devil says, I'm not doing this to you because of what you did. I'm doing this to you because of who you are. And then the devil explains. In the beginning of creation, there were just angels, and then you have the 6 days of creation, and at the end of the 6 days of creation, God creates human beings little less than divine. Male and female, God created them little less than divine in the image of God. And because they are in the image of God, everyone had to bow down to them. Because they are little less than divine, but still less than divine, they had to bow down to God, but they are in the image of God, and all the other creatures had to bow down to Adam and Eve, including the angels. But there was one angel who said, I will not bow down to the newly created humans. I refuse to bow down. It is not right, said this angel, that the older should bow down before the younger. And for that, God cast this angel down to earth, and that's how the angel became the devil, by refusing to obey God's will, not bowing down to humans. In other words, the devil believes that the humans were the cause of his downfall. He says, I'm hunting you for who you are. A broader approach says, according to the life of Adam and Eve, part and parcel of being human is that life is a mixed bag. Good things happen and bad things happen. And the devil says they're not because of what you did. Now, on the one hand, this seems like a non-answer. How could that be the answer to why do people suffer? Because life is a mixed bag. A lot of the power comes from the answers that this text rejects. For example, it rejects the pop psychology answer, well, everything happens for a reason. Anyone ever heard that before in the face of tragedy? I hate it when people say that. I say, but there's a reason I'm going to punch you in the face is what comes to mind. Or, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. I hate that too. Let's see if you can handle a punch in the face. Maybe it's a blessing in disguise. Maybe a punch in the face is a blessing in disguise. There are these pop psychology answers that this text, we're going to have time at the end for questions, so please don't forget your questions, so we'll have time to do it justice at the end. The life of Adam and Eve rejects those pop psychology answers. It also rejects Deuteronomy, and it rejects Job. It's not that we're never going to know why. It's not that life is fair. Rather, according to the life of Adam and Eve, life is a mixed bag. And in particular, it rejects the answer that we are being punished for something we did. This is not retribution. When you suffer, it's not because God is sending you a punishment. Let's look a little more closely at this tree from which Adam and Eve ate, the tree of knowing good and evil. Anyone remember where this tree was in the Garden of Eden? Give you a leading question. Was it in the periphery of the garden or was it in the middle of the garden? It was right in the middle of the garden. It was a setup. Adam and Eve had no choice. There is nothing they could have done differently. I'll give you an analogy. Suppose you are babysitting for a 3-year-old. And with this 3-year-old, you bake brownies. And you tell the 3-year-old that he cannot have the brownies until tomorrow. And you send him off to bed. But before you send him off to bed, you take one of the brownies and you put it on his pillow. Whose fault is it really when the 3-year-old eats the brownie? It was not Adam and Eve's fault. If God really didn't want Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, God could have put that tree somewhere else. Furthermore, they were outgunned. They were up against the very leader of darkness. There is nothing they could have done differently. In our own lives, the life of Adam and Eve comes along to teach there is nothing we could have done differently. Let us not live our lives filled with regret. Let us not think that we are being punished for mistakes we made years ago or days ago or hours ago. That's the first ancient answer outside of the Bible to why do people suffer, it's because life is a mixed bag. We have Deuteronomy that says life is fundamentally fair. We have Job that says life is fundamentally enigmatic. And we have the life of Adam and Eve that says life is a mixed bag. We have two more to look at. The next one comes from another ancient document called the Apocalypse of Abraham. Apocalypse is a literary genre. There may be people at home taking notes. I'm sorry, I cannot help you spell apocalypse. I actually can barely help you spell anything. My spelling is atrocious, I don't mind telling you. It's because I went to an open classroom school when I was a child. And when I was supposed to be learning things like spelling in my times tables, they asked me what I wanted to learn instead of telling me what I should learn, and as a result, I didn't learn anything. So I don't know my times tables, and I regularly, I can't even get spelling close enough for like spell check to do the rest. The only silver lining is that because I went to an open classroom school, I feel very good about myself and don't care that I don't know anything. But my spelling is atrocious, and so Apocalypse, you're on your own. I don't know how to spell it. It's a literary genre. It is Abraham's early life. It starts with Abraham's life as a child. Remember Abraham from the Bible? We just read about him. What's his story? You know, the only thing we know from the Bible about Abraham is that he was a spectacularly bad husband and father. Remember what happens with Abraham, right? Abraham is married to Sarah, and they cannot have children. And that is a very difficult thing for a couple to navigate. But even by that metric, they don't handle it well. Remember what happens? Sarah says, well, honey, why don't you try it with the maid? Which he does. And then he has a child out of wedlock with his wife's handmaiden, and nobody could have seen this coming. Now there's tension in the household. And so Abraham kicks his lover and his firstborn child out to die in the wilderness. This is the Torah portion that we generally read before the one we read on the high holidays. You remember the binding of Isaac, when Abraham has a child with, of all people, his wife, and that one doesn't go well either. There is a reason there are not more father-son picnics in the Bible. The first one went very badly. Abraham almost kills his son. Remember, Abraham goes up on the mountain and ties his child up and takes a knife over him, and it's only by an intervention by God's self, by an angel, that Abraham doesn't actually slaughter his son who is tied up. Which explains why Isaac is such a spectacularly bad husband and father. Isaac gets married, and then he and his wife have 2 children, and in the family tradition, the first thing the parents do is choose a favorite child. Isaac chooses a favorite child, his wife chooses a favorite child, and then Isaac goes prematurely senile, to the point where he cannot tell the difference between his child and a goat. Remember, Jacob dresses up as a goat, and Isaac is, well, that must be my kid. And he gives Jacob the blessing that was meant for Jacob's older brother. And then Isaac realizes what happened, and Esau also realizes. And in one of the saddest scenes in the Bible, Esau asks his father, he says, but Daddy, don't you have a blessing for me too? And the answer is no, and then Isaac dies, which explains why Jacob is such a spectacularly bad husband and father. Remember Jacob? He's walking in his way and bang, love at first sight. He sees the woman, he says, that's the woman I want to marry. He sees her, falls in love. The only thing is he can't afford her. He has to work for 7 years to get the woman of his dreams. And he does. He works day in, day out, every single day, week after week, month after month, year after year. For 7 years, he finally earns the woman of his dreams. But oops, he marries the wrong sister. Don't you hate it when that happens? A fact he does not realize until the next morning. He spends the whole night with the wrong woman, whom he has known for 7 years, and doesn't realize it. I think it's fair to say that Jacob does not appreciate the depth of the human soul. In the family tradition, they start having children. He eventually marries the right sister, too. By the way, the women in Genesis are also not particularly happy. Talk about sibling rivalry. Don't you hate it when your sister is married to your husband? They start having children, this family of sorts. And in the family tradition, the first thing Jacob does is he chooses a favorite. He chooses Joseph. Remember Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat? How many people saw the musical? How many people read the original in the Bible? Good enough. To quote my colleague, Rabbi Larry Kushner, and my dear friend, here's a Hanukkah experiment you can try at home. See what happens if you give only one of your children a fancy present. Because that's what Jacob does. Jacob gives Joseph this very fancy coat and gives all of his other brothers bupkas. So Joseph is walking around, nah, 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 Daddy loves me best, which is true. And the other brothers don't like it, and they end up selling him off into slavery. Anyone remember who buys Joseph to bring him down to Egypt? Anyone happen to remember? What? The travelers, that's right. They are the Ishmaelites. His cousins, remember Abraham's dalliance with the maid? That was Ishmael. These are the Ishmaelites who bring him down to Egypt. Guess who's coming to dinner? Meanwhile, Jacob now deals with the apparent death of his favorite son by choosing a new favorite son, as what else would one do? And now Benjamin is his favorite son, and now we get to this shocking moment when there is a famine in Canaan. And Jacob gathers his children and says, I want all of you to go down to Egypt because there's food in Egypt and there's a famine here. He says, I want all of you to go down except for Benjamin because I love him. What a terrible thing for a father to say to his children. And we know why he was such a bad father. Because Isaac was a bad father. And we know why Isaac was a bad father. Because Abraham was a bad father. But what happened to Abraham? We have an answer. And the answer comes from the Apocalypse of Abraham, which opens with 7-year-old Abraham working for his father Terach. His father Terach is a manufacturer of idols. He is, you might say, in the God biz. And you may know this about Terach and the idols from the Midrash. This is an expanded version that the Midrash summarizes. From the Apocalypse of Abraham, 7-year-old Abraham is walking around and he's helping his father out, as sons often do with their fathers. And it turns out there is a God called Master of Nations. And Abraham picks up Master of Nations, but he's a kid, and the head falls off. Don't you hate it when the head falls off of your God? And he goes to his father and he says, Daddy, the head fell off of Master of Nations. And his father Terach says, don't worry about it. We'll put a new one on tomorrow. And this is Abraham's first red flag, Abraham's first sign that perhaps the idols are not actual gods. The next sign comes when Abraham is tasked with selling 6 figurines, as we would now call them, or 6 gods as they call them. He goes to the main road and he goes out on a camel, and there are merchants on the main, no, I guess he goes out on a donkey and there is a camel on the main road, and it turns out camels and donkeys don't get along, and the donkey I'm from New York, I've never seen these things before. But the donkey brays, which is a verb that I never use in real life. But the long and the short of it is, he's got these 6 idols, and 3 of them fall into the lake next to the main road. And the merchants now see that this kid is selling gods, and they pay him for all 6. Abraham doesn't have to worry, he's got enough money. But on his way back to Daddy, Abraham is wondering, why couldn't the idols swim? And this is his second red flag, that the idols have no power. He now comes back, and his father tells him to cook dinner, which he does. He lights a fire, he puts some food on the fire, but Abraham also has an impish side to him. Abraham knows that Master of Fire, the God over fire, is made of wood. And God takes this God, Abraham takes this God, the Master of Fire, and puts it next to the fire that he's using to cook dinner and says, Master of God, you watch over the fire. And Abraham goes away. Abraham comes back, and the fire has destroyed Master of Fire. And Abraham now knows that these idols have no power. And he goes to tell his father. He says, Daddy, you're not going to believe what happened. I put Master of Fire next to the fire, but the fire destroyed Master of Fire. And Abraham's father doesn't get it. He says, all praise to Master of Fire. I will make a new one tomorrow. So we see that Abraham is a misunderstood visionary. Abraham, and perhaps Abraham alone, knows that the whole world order is based on folly, is based on nothingness. And furthermore, his own father represents that old world order. Abraham recognizes that there is no power in these gods. And now he starts thinking about, well, what does have power? Maybe the rain, maybe the sun, maybe the earth. And as he thinks about it, he realizes that in some sense, each one of these has more power than the other. It's a cosmic game of rock, scissors, paper. There is no single most powerful element. And then Abraham realizes, well, if that's the case, there must be one God over everything. And as Abraham has that thought, Abraham hears that God's voice crying, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says, yes. And the voice says, Abraham, leave your father's house. And Abraham leaves his father's house, and God destroys the house with his father in it. So it's not just that Abraham was a misunderstood genius. It's that Abraham's own father died for what it is that Abraham discovered. And you knew it had to be something like that. Because most people, when they're told to kill their kid, they say no. So we see what happened with Abraham. The second part of this apocalypse of Abraham is an apocalypse in the literary sense. It's an audience with God. Abraham is escorted up to the heavens. Abraham sees the angels, sees crowds, all the symbols from an apocalypse, hears loud noises, sees bright lights, great silence, and an audience with God. And now Abraham can ask God anything he wants. And Abraham asks God, why do people suffer? The exact same question we saw from the life of Adam and Eve. And now we have sort of a Socratic dialogue between God and Abraham. And God brings out the point that people are rewarded and people are punished, that the world is fair if you wait long enough. In the world to come, everything evens out. Now, you know a different version of this theory. How many people here have heard of heaven and hell? That's right. In Judaism, this comes from the apocalypse of Abraham. The apocalypse of Abraham, God says to Abraham, good people are rewarded and bad people are punished, but not in this life, in the world to come. And Abraham says, well, why is anybody punished in the world to come? Why don't we all go to heaven in the world to come? And there's more Socratic dialogue, and God asks Abraham, why did your father suffer? Why did your father suffer? Why did I smite your father is what God means. And Abraham says, for the choices he made. And God says, yes, that's right. The apocalypse of Abraham suggests that people and people alone in the animal kingdom can choose, as we heard in the sermon. The apocalypse of Abraham suggests that we are able to make a choice, and the price we pay for being able to make that choice is that we can choose poorly. I'll give you an example. Suppose next to this room there was an alternative universe, a parallel universe, exactly like our own, in every detail, except that over there they could not make a choice. So there's a room over there with people just like us, but they cannot choose. They cannot choose to do something nice for you. They cannot choose to marry you. They cannot choose to give you a gift. Interacting with people in that universe is exactly the same as interacting with the machines they have at the parking lot where you push a button and get a ticket. Interacting with them is like interacting with an automatron. Would you choose to live in that world? The apocalypse of Abraham comes along to say that we have free will, and because we have free will, not everything goes well. So now we have 4 of our 5 answers of why people suffer. The first is Deuteronomy, because life is fundamentally fair. The second is Job, because life is fundamentally enigmatic. The third is the life of Adam and Eve, which is that life is fundamentally a mixed bag. And now we have the apocalypse of Abraham coming along to say that life is eventually fair and that people suffer because it's part of having free will. We have one more book, one more answer, and then we're going to tie it all together. The 5th answer comes from the book of Enoch, which I can spell. That's E-N-O-C-H. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch, of these ancient books, was far and away the most popular book of antiquity. Everybody had read Enoch. Everybody knew about Enoch. It's actually even preserved in the Apocrypha of the Ethiopic Church. We're not going to go into details of how, but it was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody in antiquity knew about Enoch. Enoch starts with an observation about deciduous trees. Enoch notices that deciduous trees grow leaves in the summer when it is hot and when people need shade. And then the trees lose their leaves in the winter when it is cold and people need sunlight. In other words, Enoch says God's perfect world works in perfect concert. Everything working together. The trees and the seasons and people and the sun all conspire in God's perfect world to make everything perfect. Similarly, Enoch says the angels. The angels are immortal, and therefore angels don't procreate. There is never a next generation of angels. They don't need a next generation. Angels are immortal. People, on the other hand, all is for the kinder. We're always thinking about the next generation. We're always concerned about the children. People die, and they're always concerned about the next generation. Once again, Enoch said, God's perfect world working in perfect concert, immortal beings never having a next generation, mortal beings always being concerned about the next generation, except right there in the book of Genesis. As soon as people are created, the text tells us that the angels on high saw the human women and came down to earth and mated with the women, and the women gave birth to wicked giants. This is in the text of Genesis. Now, you may not be familiar with this text because this is a text that we usually skip over. I mean, after all, angels mating with humans and giving birth to giants, that's a little bit too weird even by Torah study standards. This is the part where the leader says, hey, look over there. Nope, we're on page 7. If you would just turn to page 7, please. No need to read page 6. We're on page 7. But it's right there in the text. The angels gave birth with the women, sired giants through the women. This is the wickedness that causes God to flood the earth. It's one complete story. The reason there is wickedness on the earth is because the angels disobeyed God. Enoch looks at this story and says, wait a minute. That can happen? Angels can disobey God? And Enoch comes to the conclusion that God's perfect world has gone awry. Enoch comes to the conclusion that we are no longer living in God's perfect world in perfect concert. And this message resonated hugely 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years in Jerusalem, 1,000 years of sacrifice was coming to an end. Remember, the Jews had lived in Jerusalem since the time of King David. Now that looks like it's coming to the end. The Romans are in charge. They are overtaxed. They are underserved. Everything is going crazy. There's a new world order. They thought they were living in unprecedented times. Anybody here ever feel like you're living in unprecedented times? Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. The book of Enoch resonated hugely 2,000 years ago, and I think it resonates hugely now as well. The notion that not every bit of suffering has a reason behind it. This book in particular rejects the idea that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. God had nothing to do with this. This is not what was supposed to happen. You look, for example, at 19-year-olds who died of COVID. That wasn't supposed to happen. This is not God's perfect world working in perfect concert, and that is the fifth of our 5 answers. Deuteronomy says that life is fundamentally fair, and Job says that life is fundamentally enigmatic. Life of Adam and Eve says that life is fundamentally a mixed bag. The Apocalypse of Abraham says that the price we pay for having free will is that we're going to make the wrong choices. And Enoch comes along and says we live in a broken world. I promised you time for questions. We have time for questions now. There's a huge echo in the room, and I've taken the only microphone. So I know this goes against our New Yorker nature. Please speak slowly and clearly and loudly, starting right in the back. Yes. And I'll repeat the questions. So the question is about the word enigmatic. Could I substitute the word random? Maybe. The point of enigmatic is that we don't know. So one possibility, one part of enigmatic would be random, but another part of enigmatic could be that there is a cosmic system of justice. Another part of enigmatic could be that the life of Adam and Eve is right. Enigmatic means we will never know why bad things happen, and random would be there is no reason why. So it's the difference between us not knowing why and there being no reason why. So it's very close, but not quite the same, I don't think. A good question, thank you. Yes, please. Enigmatic can also mean puzzling. Thank you very much. You know, I think you're going to get a point for that. So now it's even 1 point on each side. Not that it's a competition. Enigmatic can also mean puzzling because we are puzzled by it. We as humans are puzzled by things we don't understand. And we try and come up with answers, and sometimes that serves us really, really well. You know, we're puzzled by illness, and so we try and invent medicine. We're puzzled by why it gets cold in the winter, and we invent central heating, but we're puzzled by why people suffer, and we invent a system of reward and punishment, and that answer does not serve us well. Sometimes our curiosity is in our favor, and sometimes it's not, so thank you very much for that. We are often puzzled by things we don't understand. And I guess the book of Job, in some sense, says it's time to stop being puzzled. It's time just to recognize that you're never going to understand. Other questions? Please. Another great question. I hate to say it, but now they're pulling ahead because great questions get points. So the question is, Tikkun Olam seems to be the antidote to Enoch. The notion is that if God's world has gone awry, Tikkun Olam, fixing the world, is to fix God's world. But what does that mean we are going to implement? Does that mean that we are going to make things fair? I don't know. I think that, and this is going to tie into something we're going to get to in just a couple of minutes, I think that each of these 5 philosophies has its place. And I think that part of the goal is figuring out when to apply which one. I think the most intuitive one is fairness. But the fundamental problem with fairness is that we always look at it from an asymmetric perspective. You know, one person gets cancer and the other doesn't. You don't say it's fair that she got cancer. It's unfair that she got cancer. But in your mind, you're thinking, well, to fix it, we should have her not get cancer. But an equally fair solution would be to strike the other woman with cancer as well. So the notion of fairness, you know, one way to achieve it would be to make sure that everybody suffers, and that's not usually what we mean. We usually mean that the suffering is unfair, and right at the beginning, like someone said about the dogs, that the dogs seem to complain more bitterly about unfairness when they're getting the short end of the stick. So I do think there's a role for fairness. I don't think we should be slaves to fairness, and I think many of us are. Other questions? Please. Karma, what goes around comes around. Yes, the idea of karma is cosmic fairness. The idea of karma is that you have a perfectly righteous person, and this is another answer to Deuteronomy. You have a perfectly righteous person who is stricken with a god-awful disease, and you look at their life and you say, he didn't do anything wrong. I've known him his whole life. He's been flawless and perfect. Ah, in this life, maybe. You don't know what he did in a previous life to deserve it. So the notion of karma is another way of trying to preserve fairness, yes. Any other questions before we start to tie it all together? Remember Unatana Tokef? The prayer we all love to hate. Who by fire, who by water, who by drowning, who by stoning, who shall die and who shall live? The prayer that seems to scream fairness. There's hardly a more fairness-laden text than Unatana Tokef. This seems to say, yes, for sure, the world is fair. God is judge. God is the perfect judge. God is the judge of fairness, and everything is fair. Here's what's interesting, and not a lot of people know this, and this is the secret message I promised in the write-up. Even though this prayer about fairness looks like it's talking about Deuteronomy, guess which book of the Bible it quotes more than any other? The book of Job. Unatana Tokef cites Job, as if to say, not that the world is fair, but that you are going to be tempted to think that the world is fair. Don't fall victim to that thinking. The real message facing us on Yom Kippur is not just what did I do wrong, not just what can I say sorry for. Those are certainly important. It is also, don't be led down the false alley of everything bad that happens is because of sin and everything good that happens is because of merit. That is only part of the answer. There are lots of answers to why people suffer and to why people thrive. Our task on Yom Kippur is to open up our vision and not to be led astray by our childhood biases. Those childhood biases will make you miserable. Those childhood biases will make every tragedy worse. And as we know from the life of Adam and Eve, no one's life is free of tragedy. We do live life as a mixed bag. All 5 of these have their role. One of the most important things we learn from antiquity is that important questions have more than one right answer. Here we have seen 5 right answers. We have several hours left of Yom Kippur. It is my pleasure and my honor to invite you to explore the breadth of our ancient text, the breadth of our answers, and the different ways we can understand our lives. Thank you so much for joining me for this hour.